Depictions of colonial warfare were often reduced to a conflict between civilized and uncivilized. It was a common belief that the states of Africa were simply nations of savages, incapable of withstanding the West and in dire need of a civilizing force. But this was not always the case. A dismissive attitude such as this one distorted reality, and led to the destruction of the cultural heritage of countless groups across the African continent. Imperialism in places such as Africa provide an important lesson, warning us of generalizing entire groups of people. Furthermore, in most wars there were no definitive good guys or bad guys. Each individual soldier had his own reason for fighting, whether it was compulsory or not. And while it's very important to recognize the driving political forces behind a war, the genuine acts of heroism and bravery of the men who fought them should never be conflated with the motives of the men who start them. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. In this video we'll be discussing the Anglo-Zulu War, but first I'd like to mention today's sponsor. Vikings War of Clans is a large-scale strategy game that'll pique your interest within 5 minutes of playing. With over 20 million players, the game actually holds 10 times more Viking players than the actual amount of Vikings that have existed. The game features massive online battles, as shown here, and boasts a great mix of 3D graphics and smooth gameplay. You can install Vikings War of Clans right now, using my special link below, which grants you 200 gold, a protection shield, and your place in Valhalla for free. This video was also made in collaboration with History with Hilbert on YouTube, but more on that later. The year is 1806, the start of the War of the Fourth Coalition. In response to Holland's entry into the war on the French side, the British seized the Cape Colony. From that point on, the United Kingdom would retain control of South Africa, meaning the Dutch colonists who resided there were now under the jurisdiction of the British. Britain would preside over the colony in a rather laissez-faire manner, as it proved to be a vital trading route to India, but as far as they knew, the region didn't contain any valuable trading resources. 1 decade later saw the rise of the infamous Shaka Zulu, who made a career out of conquest against his tribal neighbors. He would carve out a powerful kingdom in southeastern Africa, but his reign wouldn't last for too long, as in 1828 his half-brother Dingane murdered him and seized the throne. Unlike Shaka, Dingane wasn't well respected by his people, and this flaw would eventually lead to his demise. His policy towards the neighboring British was by and large one of neutrality. Still, any settlers trespassing in his land met a grim fate. Let's jump forward to 1835 and take another glance at the British Cape Colony. The relations between the British administration and Dutch settlers, called the Boers, were by this time abysmal. The main point of contention came from the abolition of slavery in the Cape Colony. This wouldn't affect many British citizens, but to the Boers, who relied off of cheap slave labor, it was crippling. All of this would lead to a mass emigration called the Great Trek. A key figure in this emigration movement was Piet Retief and his group of Dutch settlers who were called the Voortrekkers. Unlike some other Boer migrants, he took his group of followers to the far eastern coast, known as Natal. Retief went on to ask the leader of the Zulu, Dingane, for permission to settle in the land of Drakensberg in 1838. Dingane agreed, but under one condition. Retief would need to recapture some Zulu cattle that were stolen by other local tribes. Retief agreed and successfully returned them, but upon returning to Dingane, he found an entire Zulu army, or Impi, waiting for him. They slaughtered him and all of the settlers that were with him indiscriminately. This was the first major clash between the Zulu and European settlers. Because of the incident, a British expeditionary force was sent to the port of Natal to intervene in the case of any future border conflicts. But when they arrived, they found Boer settlers occupying the city. The Boers had heard about the massacre and wanted revenge. So under leadership of Andreas Pretorius, the Boers prepared to strike back against the Zulu, using the port of Natal as a staging point. On the 16th of December, 1838, 12,000 Zulu warriors attacked Pretorius' wagon laager in the Battle of Blood River. The battle culminated in exactly what the name suggested. The Zulu sustained around 3,000 casualties, with the Boers sustaining only 3. This humiliating defeat would lead to a near civil war in Zululand. More Boer immigrants poured into the region of Natal, and in 1839 the Boers officially seized Port Natal from the British and founded a city called Pietermaritzburg, officially establishing the Natalia Republic with the support of the Netherlands. After the Zulu defeat at Blood River, there was much clamor from Dingane's political rivals, whom he would promptly have executed, but one got away, Mapande. Mapande had roughly 17,000 followers. The Boers told Mapande to return to Zululand, and they would help him seize the throne if he agreed to recognize Natalian sovereignty. Mapande agreed, and ousted King Dingane with the help of the Boers. With the border secured, the Boers began to overstep their boundary. They pressed thousands of Zulu into domestic service by using their newly acquired influence in the region. As one could imagine, the British were outraged. The Boers were shaking up the social and political landscape in the region. The Boers kept battling local tribes in the east as they migrated, and the British just couldn't let this go on. They sent a regiment to reoccupy Port Natal in 1842, and Pretorius, who was now Prime Minister of the Natalia Republic, retaliated by confronting the British in the Battle of Congela, facing defeat as more British forces arrived from Cape Town. Just a year after the battle, the British officially annexed Natal, and with that, nearly all of the Boers living in the region fled far northward. Eventually, they carved out their own republic in 1852, called the Transvaal Republic, and later the Orange Free State in 1854. Border conflicts continued to raise tension all over the region. As time went on, another succession war was fought in Zululand as Mpande grew old. His two sons, Cetshwayo and Mombaze, fought for control. After the Battle of Ndandikasuka in 1856, Cetshwayo won the succession war. From that point on, he was the de facto ruler, and his father Mpande would remain a figurehead until his death. Cetshwayo went on to stress a policy of non-aggression and cooperation with the British, as neither side sought armed conflict. He eventually met with the British Secretary for Native Affairs, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, who officially recognized Cetshwayo's legitimacy in 1861. Unlike some of his predecessors, Cetshwayo was very clever. He recognized the threat of the ever-encroaching Boers, and so he sought to raise a large standing army similar to that of Shaka. He also enforced strict military discipline and rule, and enforced celibacy for all young soldiers in his army until they proved themselves in battle. As you can imagine, this provided Zulu warriors with quite a compelling reason to fight. There was one problem the Zulu had with their military policy. A large conscripted army and a state of non-aggression with Britain were ostensibly at odds. This resulted in an even more precarious situation in the region, which would only worsen with time. In 1867, everything changed. Diamonds were discovered in South Africa, and the British became very interested. A surge of immigrants from all over Europe flooded into South Africa and began colonizing the interior of the region. As the borders between the Boers, British, and Zulu began to blur, conflict became unavoidable. The British went so far as to seize West Griqualand because of the diamond rush. And because of the increase of European influence in South Africa, the Boers gained even more confidence and began picking another fight with the Zulu. A dispute arose over an area around Blood River. The Boers claimed that it was given to them by the previous king Mpande, but Cetshwayo recognized the ploy. We'll get back to that later. 7 years after diamonds were discovered, Lord Carnarvon, the colonial secretary for Great Britain, who was also the man responsible for forming the Confederation of Canada, began his project of confederating South Africa in 1874. But he wasn't going to micromanage this enterprise, so he asked Sir Henry Bartle Frere, a famed governor in British India, to unite South Africa for him, and if he could do it, Frere could become governor of the South African Confederation. Fast forward a few years later in 1877 when a fight broke out between Transvaal and their neighbors. This time it was out of hand, and Lord Carnarvon told Shepstone to annex the region of Transvaal. And because the British took the region, they were now in charge of the border dispute over Blood River between the Zulu and Boers that I mentioned earlier. Frere knew that the only real threat left were the Zulu, who were recruiting tens of thousands of soldiers. Frere also knew that relations had to be improved with the Boers because of the annexation. So he ditched the non-aggression idea with Cetshwayo and supported the Boers' claims at Blood River. But before he could do that officially, he was convinced by Shepstone to put together a boundary commission in 1878 to really determine who had the valid claim there. The commission ended up reporting that the Boers had no justification to reside there at all. Frere was furious. If he released this information, the Zulu would charge in and slaughter anyone living there, so Frere would turn his attention to his military. He asked Lord Chelmsford to prepare an army in case of Zulu or Boer retaliation. Thank you for watching. This video is in collaboration with History with Hilbert on YouTube. He's actually covering the history of South Africa up until the Anglo-Zulu War, so please go check that out. He's also got a bunch of other videos on South African history if you're interested. I'd like to thank my general staff on Patreon: Kevin Bertram, Jim Talbot, Dimitri Stillerman, Jeff Antolik, Patrick Reardon, Joe Crispin, Emmanuel Kang, Ademski, Derek Bello, and everyone else listed on screen. I'd also like to thank those working on the Armchair History team for making this video possible. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time with the part 2.